Turning your PhD chapter into a journal article. Hello, my name is Charlotte Slay, and I've been working in academia and higher education for 20 years or so. I'm trained as a historian and a philosopher of science, though my interests have branched out a bit since then to include where science intersects also with literature and the arts, as well as science communication. I'm very pleased to be an honorary professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL, and I think that some of you may be reading my recently published book, Human, which I co-wrote with a colleague as your one book for 2020. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope that at least some of what I say will be helpful. And I apologise in advance, this is my first attempt at recording an online lecture, so I hope it works okay. I first supervised about a dozen PhD students and second supervised perhaps twice that number. So I've got, I think, a really good sense of the different forms PhDs can take and the different ways in which they can progress into print. And at the other end of the process, I've also spent time as an editor for an international journal. That was the British Journal for the History of Science, published by Cambridge University Press. And I ran that between 2014 and 2019. And I can say now, having done that, I definitely know how to write an article. So my best advice to you is really become an editor. And I'm not being flippant when I say that. The more you offer to edit the work of friends and colleagues, or better yet, edit some kind of journal or blog or magazine, the more you will learn about how the writing process really works and how best to structure and present your own work. It needn't even be an academic work of editing. You could edit, a blog or something fun or any topic really. It will make you more hard-headed and tough-skinned about the business of publishing, and perhaps a little bit more able to take the inevitable failures in sanguine spirit. So, the way we're going to structure today's session is in three parts. In the first part, we're going to spend time thinking about how to identify what your thing is. And I'm deliberately using quite a silly word for it there. You know, what is it that is at the core of your research? And that, I hope, will be useful for you, not only in terms of thinking about the publication of your work, but also just in terms of getting to the final stages of your PhD and preparing yourself for a viva, being able to give a good account of what it is that's the core of your research. Also absolutely super important in terms of going for jobs and things like that. In the second stage, today we're going to spend time thinking about turning your thing into a story, how to frame it in structural and narrative terms to make something that really works as an article. And then finally, in the third section, we'll talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of preparing a journal article, the things to pay attention to, and we'll spend a bit of time working on an abstract together, which is a really, really crucial part of the process. And needless to say, if we don't cover something that you think is important or hoped to hear discussion of, you're very, very welcome to send me an email. My email address is c.slay, that's S-L-E-I-G-H, c.slay@ucl.ac.uk. So here we go with section one, identify your thing and why it matters. How is writing for publication different from a PhD? Well, it's different in a couple of really key respects. A PhD is an exhaustive collection of evidence, arguments, and secondary literature. You're demonstrating that you know absolutely everything about your topic and have thought about it from every possible angle. An article, or a book for that matter, is a story. I guess that's obviously and intuitively true for those of you who are historians, but it's also true for sociology or philosophy or any topic really within the humanities. We always have a story to tell, a journey on which we're taking the reader, from what they know already to what it is that you, the writer, knows. A good story, in the sense of an academic article or a book, contains just enough evidence and argument to make it stand up, plus as much reference to secondary literature as you need to demonstrate how it contributes to the field. But it doesn't bombard the reader with everything you ever found out about your topic or require a complete coverage of the topic, like a PhD. So breathe, let that PhD compulsiveness go, and focus on writing a story. Although this session is called Turning Your PhD Chapter into a Journal Article, in many ways it makes more sense to go the other way if you can. That is, write a journal article and then turn it into a chapter. It's easier, I think, to write a really good story and then bolster it with the necessary minutiae than it is to try and work the other way. That is, to take a really detailed and comprehensive piece of writing and then try and snip it down somehow to make something jazzy out of it. Students do sometimes worry that they're not allowed to do this, that a PhD has got to be completely original work and you're not allowed to discuss things in it that you've already published. I can honestly say that no external examiner I've ever worked with has ever raised this issue. In fact, quite the reverse. If they're aware that a student has already published, they'll probably go into reading the dissertation in a more positive frame of mind. So obviously check with your supervisor whether they think it might be a problem, whether they think this is an appropriate way for you to work. But certainly my experience is that with the best students, that can often be the best way to progress. Start with a journal article and then turn it into a chapter later. Publishing before you finish writing, before you complete your PhD is obviously good for your CV. And it will also, I think, actually help you in the writing of your PhD. It can sometimes be a bit of a hall of mirrors. We kind of get absorbed in our own work. What you're doing if you're writing an article or a chapter for an edited collection is you start thinking about how other people will relate to your work, what they'll take out of it, what they'll see in it, and it can take you out of that hall of mirrors experience. I'm starting very broad here in this talk. One of the first questions is which chapter might be best suited to writing an article. But to do that, we do need to start with the broad approach and find the real fire, the real core of interest in your research topic. That's going to help you select which is the best chapter to start by publishing. Where is the real core of what you're doing? So how to identify your thing and what it matters. It's really important to return regularly to this core set of very basic questions about your research, and certainly whenever you're poised to write or to make a job application. So let me share with you these questions. Here we go. So the first question is just the you question. What do you find most compelling about this topic? And then secondly, what will people in your field find most compelling about this topic? If you're working in an interdisciplinary sort of way, you'll also want to ask, what will people in allied fields find most compelling about this topic? What's the thing that's really going to interest them about it? Is it something about the content, what you're discussing? Is it something about the way you're discussing it? And then the third way of asking this question, the third angle on it, is to think about a general audience. You might want to think about someone specific, like an auntie or an uncle, who's really interested in what you do, but really hasn't got the faintest clue about it. How can you present your work to them in a way that they can find something interesting and maybe even compelling to engage with? For a book, you need to demonstrate your answer to all three of these questions. It needs to be really clear where the core of the general, the public interest is, that's item 3. Also, where it's going to speak to members of your own field and members of allied fields, and just, if it's going to be readable, your own interest in it needs to come through clearly as well. I think for an academic article, it's really only the first two that you need to worry about. Academic articles are not typically read by the general public. They're not aiming for as big an audience as a book. Except that, of course, the first item, i.e. what you find interesting, is in reality an amalgam of 2 or 3. You've got specific academic reasons for believing your work is valuable and interesting, but somewhere deep down, there's also an ordinary human being who finds things interesting for non-academic, everyday, world relevant, or just plain quirky reasons. Be careful about putting these in an article. Articles are not typically very personal pieces of work, although the conclusion might be a place where you could make a quick mention of what you see as the significance or the interest of the work. But at the same time, don't lose sight of them. They're part of the foundation of presenting an authentically and coherently interesting body of research to your audience. There might be other places where you could explore that holistic combination of personal and academic interest. Blogs, podcasting, and conference presentations are spaces that you can do that. And I think it is valuable to keep that personal and academic interest working in tandem. But that's a topic for another day. My main point, though, is to be able to consciously identify what it is about your topic that is interesting and important. And to do this, in short, you must talk, talk, talk. The more you chat to people about your research, the more its essence and why it matters will take shape in your mind. It's the conversation that academics always have with each other. What do you do? What are you working on? Have your answer ready, keep honing it, keep thinking about it so that you can present it in a way that really reaches out to people. Chat to people at seminars, at conferences, but also in the pub, on the bus, at the hairdressers. And those last ones are really important. If you can't put it into plain English, it probably isn't very substantial. And in return, of course, help your colleagues out. Listen, listen, listen. Or perhaps better, listen, ask, listen. Keep drawing your own friends and colleagues out so that their stories become really good too. Check that your interest is in sync with your research findings. There are, in my experience, a couple of specific ways in which a student's interest can be out of sync with the research they actually write about. Let me explain. Sometimes a student will be interested in the after effects of a historical event or theme, but actually their material relates to the event itself. Their interest has overreached the material. What they promise in a paper isn't actually what they're able to deliver. In this instance, they need to reconnect with their material and find what's interesting in what they've actually got. If you're struggling, show it to your friends, ask what they find interesting. Ask your supervisor, what do you think is significant and interesting in what I've got here? Sometimes students have become so absorbed in their findings that they're thinking about what that means for the next stage in their argument without realizing that the first stage of their findings is actually news to everyone else and plenty enough for an article in itself. And I know that I'm sometimes guilty of this in my own writing. You get so absorbed, and then that story becomes old news to you and you want to move on to the next stage. But other people haven't come with you in that first stage. You need to show them the first stage of what you've got. Okay then, so the first exercise is to go through simply the 3 questions that I've outlined. You could treat the topic as meaning your dissertation as a whole, or you can be more specific and talk about the topic of one chapter if you've already decided where you want to focus. Notice how, in one sense, the topic emerges from explaining its interest rather than vice versa. So, for example, it's like thinking about the difference between being an enthusiast and an academic, or at least what an academic should be. If you meet an enthusiast at a party, it's almost always bad news. They might say something to you like, I know all the emissions for all the models of bus that are used in our city. You are going to be a very patient and good person if you keep listening to that person and find out all the data about all the buses. It's going to be very difficult to make that interesting and keep the conversation going. That's the enthusiast that you're talking to. But if they're a decent academic or a writer, they might say to you, hey, guess whether park and ride actually saves emissions, like we all think, or whether it contributes to them. Then they've established a likely topic of shared interest, which might then cause you to follow them into the specifics about buses that they know about. That's the academic's approach, if they're a good one, or the approach of a good writer. So I'll give you some time now to think about those questions before we turn to section 2.